Good evening and welcome to our quiet journey through history. May these words bring you calm and ease as you drift toward rest. Tonight, let us begin with the story of Sparta, a land where myth and reality were woven into one. Far to the south of the Greek mainland, beyond the rugged hills and into a fertile valley embraced by mountains, the beginnings of Sparta took root. Long before its name became a symbol of discipline and unshakable courage, it was a quiet land dotted with villages, streams, and groves of olive trees. Life here followed the steady patterns of the seasons, and the people were bound closely to the land they worked and the gods they worshipped. The tale of Sparta's birth begins with the arrival of the Dorians, a people from the north who descended into the Peloponnesian Peninsula in a time lost to clear memory. They did not arrive as conquerors in a single moment, but as a steady tide, bringing with them their customs, their warriors, and the belief that strength and unity could shape destiny. Their meeting with the local Achaean inhabitants was not merely a clash of arms, but a blending of traditions, forging a new identity that would carry the seeds of what Sparta would one day become. At first, Sparta was not a single city, but four closely linked villages: Pitane, Mesoa, Limne, and Cynosura. Each had its own character, its own ways, but all shared the same valley and the same need for security. In time, they joined together, understanding that unity brought safety and power. Later, the nearby settlement of Amyclae was also absorbed, its traditions woven into the growing fabric of Spartan life. This early unity was as much a matter of survival as of ambition, for the Peloponnesus was a land of shifting rivalries, and no village could stand alone for long. The earliest Spartans saw themselves as chosen by the gods. Some believed their origins were blessed by Artemis Orthia, whose ancient temple stood as a place of devotion and rites. Others traced their ancestry to the great hero Heracles, saying that his descendants, the Heracleidae, had led the Dorians to this fertile valley. These stories, half myth and half history, gave the people a sense of destiny, a belief that their lives were part of a greater divine plan. Geography shaped Sparta as much as legend. The Eurotas Valley, where the city lay, was a gift of nature, fertile land watered by the river, yet shielded from invasion by the Taygetus Mountains to the west and the Parnon Range to the east. These natural walls gave the Spartans both protection and isolation, allowing their society to grow apart from the bustling trade and seafaring life of other Greek cities. Without a harbor, their world turned inward, their strength drawn from the earth beneath their feet and the bonds between their people. From the beginning, Sparta's rule was unusual. Two kings, each from a separate royal line claiming descent from Heracles, shared the throne. One might lead the army in war, while the other oversaw matters at home and in religion. This balance prevented the power of one man from overshadowing the needs of the whole, planting the roots of a system where the stability of the state came before personal ambition. In these early centuries, life was not yet the austere, militarized existence that later defined Sparta. Families tended fields of barley and wheat, cared for vines heavy with grapes, and watched over groves of silver-green olive trees. Shepherds led their flocks along mountain paths, and craftsmen shaped tools, weapons, and everyday goods with steady hands. There was little room for luxury, yet a quiet dignity filled their days, a recognition that every task, no matter how small, contributed to the life of the community. And so, in the shelter of mountains and the slow rhythm of seasons, the foundations of Sparta were laid. strong, enduring, and bound to values that would carry them through centuries to come. As the years passed, the unity of the early Spartan settlements grew stronger. Their lives were bound together not just by necessity, but by a shared vision, a belief that their strength lay in the harmony of the whole rather than the ambition of the few. This vision was nurtured by their leaders, whose roles were as much symbolic as practical, guiding their people with traditions inherited from both Dorian and Achaean roots. The surrounding land played its part in shaping this young society. The Eurotas River was more than a source of water. It was the lifeline of the valley, feeding the crops and sustaining the animals. In spring, its banks would burst with wildflowers, while in summer, the fields shimmered under the sun. The mountains offered protection, but also demanded resilience, for their slopes were steep and their weather could turn quickly. Life here taught patience, self-reliance, and a deep respect for nature's rhythm. Even in these formative days, there was a certain discipline in the Spartan way of life. While other Greek cities filled their streets with merchants, artists, and travelers from distant lands, Sparta remained modest and reserved. They valued simplicity, and their dwellings reflected this, built for function, not display. The people were less concerned with outward beauty and more with enduring strength, a mindset that would eventually define their culture. Religion was a steady presence in their lives. Temples and shrines stood not in grand marble, but in sturdy, weathered stone, blending with the land around them. Offerings to the gods were humble, yet sincere. Baskets of grain, cups of wine, garlands of fresh herbs. Festivals were moments of shared joy, with songs and dances that honored both the divine and the bond between the people. These celebrations reminded them that they were part of a greater order, one in which the favor of the gods was as essential as the strength of their arms. The early Spartan leaders understood that unity was their most valuable resource. The dual monarchy, unusual though it was, allowed for balance. When the valley needed defending, one king would lead the warriors, while the other ensured that the home remained steady and the sacred rites unbroken. This system discouraged the rise of a single unchecked ruler, instead fostering cooperation at the highest level. It also sent a quiet message to the people. Leadership in Sparta was a shared duty, not a personal possession. Trade, though limited, still existed. The Spartans exchanged surplus grain, olive oil, and honey with neighboring regions, acquiring tools or goods they could not produce themselves. Yet they never became dependent on these exchanges, for their isolation and self-sufficiency were sources of pride. To rely too heavily on outsiders, they believed, was to invite weakness. The bond between the people and their land was unshakable. Every season brought its tasks, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and mending in winter. Families worked side by side, their children learning the skills they would one day pass on. Knowledge was not written in scrolls or kept in libraries, but carried in memory, preserved in the repetition of daily life. Over time, the character of Sparta began to take shape. The people grew accustomed to valuing endurance over comfort, duty over desire. Even in times of peace, they prepared for hardship, knowing that the world beyond their mountains was ever-changing and often dangerous. This readiness would become the heartbeat of Spartan life, though in these early centuries it was still a quiet undercurrent rather than an open call to arms. The myths of their origin continued to shape their identity. To be a Spartan was to be part of a story that stretched back to heroes and gods. Whether or not every tale was true mattered less than the unity those stories inspired. The people believed they were chosen to live in this valley, to protect it, and to uphold the ways that had been entrusted to them. And so, Sparta stood at the threshold of its destiny, a young city, born from the meeting of peoples, shaped by the land, and guided by the steady rhythm of tradition. The seeds of its future strength were already planted, though their full bloom would not yet be seen. In the quiet of the Eurotas valley, under the watchful gaze of the mountains, the Spartan spirit was beginning to awaken. In time, the quiet strength of the early Spartan settlements would no longer be contained within the valley. The land around them was rich but limited, and as their population grew, so too did their need for more fields, more pastures, and more space for the life they were building. Expansion was not a choice born of ambition alone. It was a necessity, a natural step in the unfolding story of their survival. The valley of the Eurotas, though fertile, was bordered by hills and mountains that left little room for growth. Beyond these natural walls lay other lands, held by neighboring peoples who shared neither the Spartan discipline nor their desire for unity. Some were rivals, others occasional allies, but all stood upon soil that Sparta's leaders saw as essential to their future. And so began the gradual process of reaching outward, step by measured step. This expansion was steady rather than reckless. The Spartans moved not like a sudden storm, but like a slow and relentless tide. They understood that to hold new land was not merely to claim it, but to weave it into the life of the city. Every field, every stream, every village brought under Spartan control was to be integrated, its people bound to the same order and discipline that shaped life in the valley. One of the earliest and most significant steps in this outward movement was the subjugation of neighboring communities in Laconia. These lands, lying just beyond the heart of Sparta, became part of the city's growing domain. Their inhabitants were not treated as equals, but neither were they entirely outsiders. Many became perioikoi, those who live around, free in their daily lives, yet bound to serve Sparta in trade, craftsmanship, and war when called upon. This arrangement gave Sparta new resources without overextending its control, and it allowed the city to focus on greater ambitions. Beyond Laconia lay the fertile plains of Messenia, a region whose rich soil and abundant harvests stirred Spartan desire. The lands of Messenia were wide and open, capable of feeding far more people than the narrow Eurotas valley could sustain. Yet taking them would mean more than a simple border skirmish. It would require a commitment to hold and govern land far from the city's core. For Sparta, the reward was worth the risk, and so the path toward Messenia began to unfold. The Spartans prepared carefully. Their approach to expansion was never only about battle, it was about permanence. They trained their warriors to endure not only the clash of arms, but the demands of holding distant territory. Villages that fell under their control were not left to drift. They were drawn into a web of obligations, bound by Spartan law and the expectation of loyalty. In time, the red soil of Messenia would indeed come under Spartan rule, its fields ploughed by those who no longer worked for themselves, but for the city that had conquered them. This was the moment when Sparta's nature began to shift. No longer only a community bound by shared roots, it became a power whose reach extended beyond the valley. Its strength measured not just by the discipline of its people, but by the breadth of the lands it commanded. And yet, for all its outward growth, Sparta's heart remained the same, a city shaped by its mountains, its river, and the unyielding belief that unity once forged must never be broken. The conquest of Messenia marked a turning point in the Spartan story. The fertile lands, with their wide plains and gentle hills, became the backbone of Sparta's growing strength. But such gains came with a cost, the need to control a population far larger than their own. The Messenians did not willingly surrender their freedom, and their subjugation introduced a new and defining element to Spartan society: a vast class of laborers who worked the land for their conquerors. These people became known as helots. Unlike the perioikoi, who retained a measure of freedom, the helots were bound to the soil they tilled, their harvests claimed by Sparta. They were not slaves in the market sense, yet neither were they free. Their lives were tied entirely to the needs of the state, and their labor allowed the Spartan citizens to devote themselves almost wholly to the art of war. It was here that the foundations of Sparta's military focus began to deepen, for in controlling the helots, the Spartans needed constant readiness, lest rebellion take root. Messenia's incorporation was not achieved in a single sweep, but through years of effort and endurance. Battles were fought, truces made and broken, and Spartan determination tested. Yet the outcome was clear. The lands of Messenia now fed Sparta, and the city's resources had multiplied many times over. With this abundance came the ability to support a standing force of citizens whose primary duty was defense and warfare, a path that would shape every future step. The expansion did not end there. Control of the surrounding territories solidified Sparta's dominance in the Peloponnesus. Neighboring towns, some brought into alliance, others subdued by force, came under the city's influence. The Spartans did not scatter their power. Instead, they built a strong, interconnected network, each part supporting the whole. Roads and paths linked these lands to the heart of the Eurotas Valley, carrying not only goods, but also messages, orders, and the silent presence of Spartan authority. Yet, for all its outward reach, Sparta was not driven by the same ambitions as other Greek powers. There were no dreams of distant colonies or grand naval empires. The sea remained a boundary, not an invitation. Expansion, for Sparta, was always about securing the land around them, ensuring that nothing could threaten their home from within striking distance. Each conquest, each treaty, each guarded border was another stone in the fortress of their safety. This deliberate approach gave Sparta a stability rare in the Greek world. While other cities rose and fell on the tides of trade and shifting alliances, Sparta anchored itself in the soil of the Peloponnesus. Its people understood that the strength of their city did not rest solely on the skill of its warriors, but on the unity of its lands and the order maintained within them. By the time this era of expansion slowed, Sparta had transformed from a cluster of villages into the ruling power of the southern Peloponnesus. The valley that had once been their whole world was now only the heart of a much larger domain. The mountains still stood around them, but their reach extended far beyond those stone walls into lands where the Spartan name carried both fear and respect. And so, Sparta stood not just as a city, but as the master of a realm, a power whose foundation was built on both the blessings of the land and the resolve of its people. The age of simple beginnings was over. Ahead lay the shaping of a society unlike any other in Greece, one that would become both feared and admired for centuries to come. As Sparta's lands expanded, so too did the need for a system that could hold them together. The city was not built on wealth from trade or the constant arrival of new settlers. Its strength came from order, stability, and the firm hand of governance. In Sparta, politics was never a matter of endless debate or personal ambition. It was a structure designed to endure, to protect the city and its way of life, and to ensure that every decision served the whole rather than the individual. At the center of this system stood the dual monarchy, two kings ruling side by side. This unusual arrangement, inherited from the earliest days, was more than tradition. It was a safeguard. Each king's power was balanced by the other's presence, preventing the rise of unchecked authority. One would lead the army in times of war, while the other remained in the city, tending to religious duties and overseeing the safety of the home front. This separation of roles meant that even when Sparta's warriors marched far from the valley, its governance remained steady. Yet the kings were not the sole rulers. Alongside them sat the Gerousia, a council of elders composed of men over 60 years of age, chosen for their wisdom and experience. These elders, together with the kings, discussed matters of state, prepared proposals, and ensured that decisions aligned with the customs and values of the city. Their counsel was not to be ignored. In a society that valued discipline, the voices of those who had lived through decades of service carried great weight. The daily governance of Sparta also rested in the hands of the ephors, 5 officials elected annually from among the citizens. Their role was both powerful and practical, overseeing the laws, managing relations with the helots and perioikoi, and acting as a check even on the kings themselves. In a city where no one was above the law, the ephors stood as guardians of the state's balance, ensuring that no single part of its leadership could dominate the rest. This careful system allowed Sparta to govern not only its own citizens, but also the many territories it had absorbed. The perioikoi, who lived in the surrounding towns, remained free in their daily affairs, but were bound to serve in the Spartan army when needed. They crafted weapons, built ships for trade, and maintained the flow of goods essential to the city's life. While they did not share in the political power of Spartan citizens, they were valued as part of the broader framework that kept the state functioning. The helots, however, were another matter entirely. Drawn largely from the conquered lands of Messenia and Laconia, they formed the laboring class that worked the fields and provided the food that sustained Sparta's citizens. Bound to the land, they could not be bought or sold, yet their lives were far from free. Their harvests were taken to feed the city, and their existence was marked by the constant watch of their masters. The Spartans, ever wary of rebellion, treated the helots with a mixture of dependence and suspicion, for they were both the foundation of Sparta's economy and its greatest internal threat. To maintain control, Sparta developed a system of vigilance that blurred the line between peace and war. Young men were sent into the countryside in secret missions, not as open soldiers, but as silent watchers, ready to suppress any sign of unrest among the helots. This practice, whispered about and often unspoken in public, was part of the unyielding discipline that kept the city's structure intact. In this way, the political life of Sparta was unlike that of any other Greek city. It was not a place for impassioned public speeches or shifting alliances. It was a carefully built machine, each part moving in harmony with the rest, designed not for change, but for permanence. Every law, every office, and every duty existed to preserve the stability of the city, to guard its lands, and to ensure that the way of life forged in the valley of the Eurotas would endure for generations to come. In the eyes of the Spartans, their political order was not merely a system of governance, but a reflection of their deepest values. Stability, discipline, and unity were seen as the highest virtues, and the city's structure was designed to uphold them at all costs. Every citizen understood their role in this balance, and the leaders saw themselves as custodians of a way of life handed down from their ancestors. The dual monarchy, the Gerousia, and the ephors were not competing forces, but strands woven into the same fabric. Each had its sphere, its duties, and its limits. The kings could not act without the counsel of the elders, and the elders could not move without the approval of the ephors. It was a slow, deliberate form of decision-making, one that avoided rash actions and sought the path that would least disturb the order of the city. In a world where power often changed hands through sudden coups or shifting alliances, Sparta's steadiness was unusual and deeply respected. Beyond the city itself, the territories under Spartan control were managed with the same careful hand. The Perioikoi, though free, lived under the shadow of Sparta's authority. They were craftsmen, traders, and farmers whose lives provided the goods and services the Spartan citizens themselves no longer produced. They built weapons, tended markets, and kept trade routes open. Yet they knew that their independence was limited. While they might govern their own towns, their loyalty to Sparta was expected and enforced. The Helots, however, were the most tightly bound to the city's will. Their numbers far exceeded those of the Spartan citizens, a fact that shaped much of the city's policy. The Spartans understood that such a population, if united in resistance, could overthrow their rulers. Thus, the relationship between citizen and helot was one of constant tension. The helots worked the fields, tended the crops, and delivered the harvests, while the Spartans trained, patrolled, and watched. This vigilance became a way of life. Young Spartan men, already hardened by years of military training, participated in secret missions meant to keep the helots in a state of fear and submission. These actions were rarely spoken of openly, for they were as much about maintaining control as they were about preserving the image of Spartan strength. The result was a society in which the rulers could dedicate themselves entirely to defense and discipline, while the labor of others sustained the city's needs. The political structure was deeply intertwined with the social divisions. Full citizens, known as Spartiates, formed the smallest part of the population, yet they held the greatest responsibility. Their duty was to maintain the security and honor of the state, which they did through constant readiness for war. The Perioikoi occupied a middle ground, necessary, respected for their work, but excluded from the political life of the city. The helots formed the base of the pyramid, bound to serve yet essential to the survival of all above them. In this system, every role was fixed, and movement between them was nearly impossible. The lines between citizen, perioikos, and helot were drawn not by wealth or ambition, but by birth. This rigidity, while limiting, also created a society where each person understood their place and their duties. It was a world where change came slowly, and where tradition was both shield and chain. The conquered lands, from the fertile fields of Messenia to the towns of Laconia, were bound into this order as firmly as the city itself. Roads connected them, patrols guarded them, and messengers carried the commands of Sparta's leaders. The stability of the entire system depended on vigilance, discipline, and the unshakable unity of the ruling class. Thus, the politics of Sparta were never about personal glory or sudden reform. They were about preserving what had been built, a society shaped by conquest, sustained by labor, and defended by those who saw themselves as the guardians of a sacred trust. This unwavering focus allowed Sparta to endure while others rose and fell, and it set the stage for the unique traditions and laws that would define the city in the centuries to come. In Sparta, tradition was not a mere echo of the past. It was the thread that held the fabric of the city together. Every custom, every ceremony, every shared meal was part of a rhythm that guided daily life, linking one generation to the next. In a world that often shifted with the winds of fortune, the Spartans stood anchored in practices that gave them both identity and strength. One of the most enduring traditions was the syssitia, the communal meals shared by the citizens. From the moment a young man completed his training, he joined one of these groups, where warriors, elders, and leaders sat side by side. The meals were simple: bread, barley porridge, cheese, figs, and the dark, rich black broth made from pork, vinegar, and salt. There was no indulgence here, no lavish feasts. The purpose was not pleasure, but equality, to remind every Spartan that they were part of the same brotherhood, sustained by the same food, bound by the same duty. Religious festivals were another heartbeat of the city. The Spartans honored their gods with a quiet reverence, their rituals woven into the very structure of their society. Artemis Orthia, in particular, was held in deep respect. Her sanctuary was the site of ceremonies that tested endurance and discipline, echoing the values that Sparta prized most. During certain rites, young men would endure trials of pain, not for spectacle, but as a demonstration of their resilience and devotion. These acts were as much about the spirit as the body, teaching that true strength was the mastery of the self. The Gymnopedia, a festival of dance and music, celebrated not only physical grace, but the unity of the community. In the heat of summer, the young and the old alike would gather in the open spaces, their movements forming patterns that had been repeated for generations. Songs told of victories, heroes, and the virtues of courage and obedience. For a people so often associated with the sword, these moments revealed another side, a culture that understood the importance of shared joy, memory, and rhythm. From birth, a Spartan's life was touched by tradition. Newborns were examined by elders, not as an act of cruelty, but as part of the belief that every citizen must be strong enough to serve the state. Those deemed healthy were welcomed into the community. Those who were not would not survive in the harsh demands of the Spartan world. This was not seen as individual fate, but as a measure taken for the survival of all. Marriage itself was bound to custom. While other cities held elaborate wedding feasts, Sparta's ceremonies were understated, focused less on celebration and more on the joining of two households in service to the state. Even the way a bride was presented to her husband followed ritual forms, reflecting a society where personal life was always intertwined with civic duty. Every tradition, whether in the dining hall, the festival ground, or the family home, carried the same message. The individual was a part of something greater. To be Spartan was to live within this web of customs, to draw strength from it, and to pass it on unchanged to those who would follow. Among the customs that shaped daily life, the upbringing of children held a place of particular importance. In Sparta, a child was not raised for the comfort of family alone, but for the service of the state. Boys at the age of 7 left their homes to enter the agoge, the rigorous system of education and training that prepared them for citizenship. This was more than a school. It was a passage into a life defined by discipline, endurance, and loyalty. Lessons were given in reading and music, but above all, in the skills of survival and the art of war. The bonds formed in the agoge lasted a lifetime, for they were built on shared hardship and mutual reliance. Girls, too, were shaped by tradition, though in different ways. They remained in their homes, yet were encouraged to be physically strong, to run, to wrestle, and to train their bodies. This was not vanity, but preparation. For in the Spartan view, strong mothers bore strong children, and the health of the next generation was a matter of civic duty. It was one of the ways Sparta stood apart from other Greek cities, where women's roles were often far more restricted. Seasonal rituals marked the passing of time. The Carneia, held in honor of Apollo, brought the community together in late summer. For 9 days, normal routines paused, and the city entered a time of music, races, and ceremonial offerings. Yet even in celebration, there was an undercurrent of discipline. The games and contests were not merely for amusement. They reflected the values of precision, endurance, and harmony that Sparta held dear. Another tradition lay in the way Spartans spoke. Their words were measured, brief, and purposeful, a style so distinctive that it became known as laconic. Stories told of envoys from other cities receiving replies from Spartan leaders that were as short as they were unshakable. This manner of speech was not a mere habit, but an expression of the Spartan belief that action was worth more than words, and that clarity left no room for weakness. The rhythm of these customs created a life in which every citizen knew the steps. From the shared meals to the festivals, from the training grounds to the quiet rituals at the temple, tradition gave structure to the days and meaning to the years. Change came rarely, and when it did, it was met with caution. In this way, the customs became not only a reflection of the past, but a shield for the future. Even in times of war, traditions were upheld. Before marching into battle, the warriors would perform their sacred rites, offering prayers and sacrifices to seek the gods' favor. They advanced not in a chaotic rush, but in measured step, moving to the music of flutes, a tradition meant to keep their formation steady and their minds calm. To outsiders, it was a striking sight. To Spartans, it was simply the way it had always been. Through these customs, Sparta preserved more than its way of life. It preserved its very soul. Each tradition was a thread in a tapestry woven over centuries, and every Spartan, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, carried a part of it. In this unbroken chain, the city found its strength, its unity, and the sense of purpose that would sustain it for generations. In Sparta, even marriage followed a path unlike that of other Greek cities. Where elsewhere weddings were public celebrations filled with feasts, gifts, and long speeches, in Sparta they were quiet, almost secretive events. The purpose was not to display wealth or to create alliances between great families, but to unite two people in a bond that served the state as much as themselves. Personal romance, though not absent, was secondary to the greater duty of producing strong, healthy citizens for the city's future. The ceremony itself was simple. The bride's hair was cut short, and she was dressed in a plain robe, a symbolic act that erased the distinction between maiden and wife. She was then brought to her husband, often in the evening, sometimes even taken in a playful form of abduction, a tradition meant to mark the transition in a way that recalled older tribal customs. There was no public feast, no parade through the streets, only the quiet acknowledgement of a new household formed. What made Spartan marriage truly unique was the way the couple lived after the wedding. Husbands, especially in the early years of marriage, did not move in with their wives. Instead, they continued to live in the communal barracks with their fellow soldiers, sharing meals and duties as before. Visits to their wives were brief and often conducted at night, in secrecy. This separation was not seen as strange, but as necessary. The bond between comrades in arms was considered essential to the city's strength, and no personal relationship was allowed to weaken it. It was this arrangement that gave rise to another distinctive feature of Spartan society: polyandry, the practice of a woman having more than one husband. While rare in the Greek world, it was accepted in Sparta under certain circumstances, especially when the goal was to ensure that a strong woman might bear children by more than one worthy man. The focus was never on romance or possession, but on producing the healthiest possible offspring for the state. In this, the Spartans were entirely practical, guided by the same principles that shaped their training, their politics, and their laws. For women, this arrangement also meant a degree of independence unusual for the time. While their husbands lived primarily in the barracks, Spartan wives managed the household, oversaw the land, and directed the labor of the helots assigned to their family. They were not secluded as in other Greek cities, but moved freely, participating in physical training and speaking their minds in public. This freedom was not born from a belief in equality for its own sake, but from the recognition that in a city where men were often away at war, women carried the responsibility of keeping life in order. Marriage in Sparta was therefore less a private affair and more a part of the state's greater machinery. Every union was a thread in the fabric of the city's survival, and the customs surrounding it reflected the same disciplined, purposeful approach found in every aspect of Spartan life. It was not a world of courtship and romance as we might imagine, but of duty, continuity, and the quiet understanding that personal life served a higher purpose. The separation of husband and wife, though unusual to outsiders, was deeply rooted in Spartan values. It was believed that longing and distance kept the bond between them stronger, preserving both passion and respect. A husband might visit his wife quietly in the night, returning to the barracks before dawn, and in this way their encounters remained private, almost sacred, untouched by the distractions of daily life. This secrecy was not born of shame, but of the belief that personal matters should never overshadow public duty. Over time, this arrangement shaped the nature of relationships in Sparta. Affection was present, but it was expressed in ways that aligned with the city's ideals. Through loyalty, mutual respect, and the shared commitment to the survival of the state. Children born of these unions were celebrated, not with lavish ceremonies, but with the quiet pride of knowing they would one day take their place in the agoge or contribute to the strength of the community. Polyandry, though rare, was approached with the same practical mindset. In cases where a man was older or unable to father children, it was not considered dishonorable for his wife to bear children by another, often a younger and proven warrior. Such arrangements were made openly and with the consent of all involved, for the focus was never on individual possession, but on ensuring the next generation carried the strongest qualities. This practice, so foreign to other Greek states, was accepted in Sparta as simply another way to serve the collective good. For women, the independence granted by these customs came with responsibility. They managed estates, oversaw the work of the helots, and ensured that resources were used wisely. In times of war, they bore the weight of maintaining the economy, securing supplies, and keeping the rhythms of daily life unbroken. Their education, which included physical training, music, and even some literacy, prepared them for these roles. This made Spartan women among the most respected, and sometimes envied, in all of Greece. Despite this independence, marriage was still guided by the expectations of the state. Matches were often arranged with an eye to compatibility of lineage and the physical strength of both partners. Love might grow over time, but it was never the starting point. The city's needs came first. In this way, personal choice was often secondary to civic duty, yet many Spartans accepted this as a natural part of life. The quiet, disciplined nature of Spartan marriage reflected the same principles that governed their military and politics: clarity of purpose, devotion to the whole, and the avoidance of excess. There was no place for the ornate wedding feasts or elaborate dowries seen elsewhere in Greece. Instead, there was a calm understanding that every union served as a pillar in the city's enduring structure. Thus, in Sparta, love and marriage were not left to chance. They were shaped by tradition, strengthened by separation, and guided always by the belief that the needs of the city stood above the desires of the individual. In this balance between personal life and public duty lay one of the most distinctive features of Spartan society, a way of living that was both austere and deeply bound to the survival of the state. The rhythms of marriage in Sparta were closely linked to the rhythms of the city itself. Just as soldiers moved in step on the battlefield, so too did family life move in harmony with the needs of the state. Husbands trained and dined in the Syssitia, returning home only under cover of darkness. Wives oversaw the household during the day, managing land, stores, and servants with quiet efficiency. This separation, far from creating distance, fostered mutual respect. Each partner had their role, and both knew that the other fulfilled it with diligence and a sense of duty. Among the most striking aspects of Spartan marriage was the absence of the jealousy and secrecy often found in other cultures when it came to questions of lineage and parentage. In Sparta, if the state's interests required it, arrangements could be made for a wife to bear children by a man other than her husband, with his full consent. This was done not for personal indulgence, but as a deliberate act to strengthen the bloodline and ensure that the next generation of citizens would be as capable as possible. Such an arrangement was spoken of without embarrassment, for it was understood that the city's survival depended on strong, healthy warriors and mothers. This perspective extended to widows as well. A woman whose husband had died might remarry quickly, often to a man already established in the community, in order to continue contributing to the city's population and stability. There was no stigma in this, only the understanding that every citizen, male or female, had a part to play in the preservation of Sparta. Even the grief of loss was shaped by the unyielding belief that the needs of the whole must come before personal sorrow. The management of estates by women was another defining feature of Spartan life. With so many men engaged in constant training or away on campaign, women often became the de facto heads of their households. They controlled resources, directed the work of helots, negotiated exchanges, and made decisions that in other Greek cities would have been the sole domain of men. This authority gave Spartan women a confidence and influence rare in the ancient world. They were known for their athletic bearing, their direct speech, and their ability to manage affairs with the same discipline expected of soldiers. Marriage customs also ensured that family lines remained strong and property stayed within the community of full citizens. Inheritance laws favored keeping land consolidated rather than dividing it among many heirs, which meant that marriages were sometimes arranged to protect the unity of estates. This practice not only preserved wealth, but also reinforced the stability of the ruling class, ensuring that resources remained in the hands of those trained to defend and lead the state. Cultural expectations in marriage extended beyond the home. Wives were expected to encourage and even challenge their husbands to uphold the highest standards of courage and honor. Stories were told of Spartan women handing their men shields before battle, saying, "Return with it or on it." Such words were not empty threats, but reminders of the shared values between husband and wife, that a life lived without honor was no life at all, and that the defense of Sparta outweighed even survival. The emotional bonds within these marriages were often quieter than in other cultures, shaped more by mutual respect and shared purpose than by constant companionship. Affection existed, but it was strengthened by absence, deepened by the knowledge that both husband and wife bore heavy responsibilities, one on the field, the other at home. In this way, personal love and civic duty were never in conflict, but instead intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Thus, in Sparta, marriage was far from a private arrangement. It was a carefully maintained part of the city's structure, where love, respect, and duty merged into a single purpose: the survival and strength of the state. Every union was a deliberate act, every child a contribution to the future, and every household a small fortress within the greater city. In the balance between personal life and public responsibility lay one of the most distinctive features of Spartan society, a way of living that was austere, disciplined, and entirely devoted to the enduring spirit of the polis. The Sparta known to history was shaped not only by its geography, its wars, or its people, but by the vision of a single lawgiver whose influence would endure for centuries. His name was Lycurgus, and though much about him lies in the mist between legend and fact, his laws became the foundation of the Spartan way of life. Whether he was a single man, a figure shaped by generations of reformers, or partly a creation of myth, his presence is felt in every aspect of the city's identity. The laws attributed to Lycurgus were not written down. Instead, they were passed from generation to generation through memory, tradition, and practice. This alone made them unusual, for it meant they could not be easily altered or challenged by clever argument. They lived in the people themselves, in the habits of their daily lives, in the shared understanding that to be Spartan was to follow these laws without question. Central to Lycurgus's vision was the idea that the needs of the state were greater than the desires of the individual. Wealth, comfort, and personal ambition were seen as distractions that could weaken unity. To prevent such divisions, the laws encouraged equality among citizens, not in luxury or possessions, but in discipline and responsibility. Land was divided to provide each citizen with the means to support themselves and contribute to the communal meals. Gold and silver coinage were banned, replaced with heavy iron bars that made the accumulation of riches impractical and the temptation of greed less likely. Education, too, was shaped by these laws. The agoge, the system of training for boys, was not simply a military academy, but a school for life. It taught endurance, loyalty, and obedience, but also fostered cleverness and resourcefulness. Young Spartans learned to live with little, to speak with precision, and to act with purpose. Even music and dance were taught, not as luxuries, but as ways to strengthen coordination, unity, and morale. The laws also reinforced the communal nature of Spartan life. The syssitia, the shared mess halls, were more than places to eat. They were a daily reminder that no citizen stood apart from the others. Here, men of all ranks sat together, shared the same food, and spoke as equals. It was a constant lesson that the strength of Sparta came from its unity, not from the wealth or status of individuals. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Lycurgus's laws was their focus on self-sufficiency and the avoidance of foreign influence. Trade and travel were limited, not to isolate Sparta entirely, but to protect it from the customs and luxuries of other lands. Foreigners were not encouraged to settle, and Spartans themselves rarely traveled abroad without purpose. In this way, the city preserved its own character, unsoftened by the habits of others. The system was strict, but it was embraced with pride. To the Spartans, these laws were not burdens, but the path to greatness, a code that ensured their city would remain strong, united, and unyielding in the face of any challenge. The laws of Lycurgus touched every corner of Spartan life, shaping not only the city's structure, but the very character of its people. They defined how a Spartan was to live, train, speak, marry, and even think. In a world where other cities chased wealth, glory, or influence, Sparta chased a different ideal, the perfection of discipline and unity. One of the most remarkable results of these laws was the creation of a society with almost no visible inequality among its full citizens. There were no grand houses adorned with gold, no extravagant feasts meant to impress guests. Every citizen was expected to live in modest dwellings, eat the same simple meals, and train under the same demanding standards. The strength of Sparta lay not in individual splendor, but in the shared endurance of all. This equality, however, applied only to the Spartiates, the full citizens who had completed the agoge and dedicated their lives to the defense of the state. The perioikoi and helots remained outside this circle, their roles defined by necessity. Yet even in this division, the laws ensured that the citizens remained focused on their singular purpose, the preservation and defense of Sparta. Military readiness was a constant under these laws. Every male citizen was a soldier first, no matter his age or role. From youth to old age, the rhythm of training, patrols, and readiness never ceased. Even festivals and religious rites had elements of military order woven into them. Processions in precise formations, dances that mirrored the steps of battle, songs that carried the weight of history and duty. Lycurgus's reforms also placed great importance on the role of women, granting them freedoms rare in the ancient world. Women were educated, trained in athletics, and encouraged to speak their minds. This was not a gesture of equality in the modern sense, but a recognition that strong, capable women produced strong, capable children. Their authority in the home and in the management of estates was essential to the stability of the state. Another unique feature of these laws was their resistance to change. Generations passed without significant alteration to the system Lycurgus was said to have created. The laws were treated as sacred, often linked to divine approval, and breaking them was seen not merely as a civic offense, but as a betrayal of the very identity of Sparta. The Spartans believed that their survival depended on the unbroken chain of these customs, that deviation would invite weakness, and weakness would invite ruin. Because of this, Sparta became a city set apart from the rest of Greece. While Athens built its empire through trade, diplomacy, and art, Sparta stood as a fortress of discipline and tradition. Its laws, though severe, gave it a clarity of purpose unmatched in the Greek world. Outsiders might see the system as harsh, but within Sparta it was viewed as the source of their endurance, the reason their city could face challenges that might have broken others. In the quiet valleys and under the shadow of the mountains, the laws of Lycurgus lived on through the people who followed them. They were not carved into stone or recorded in scrolls, yet they were as enduring as the peaks that surrounded the city. For as long as Spartans lived by these laws, they believed their city would remain unshaken, a place where unity and discipline stood above all else. Life within Sparta was built on a foundation of discipline and shared purpose. Every citizen, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, lived within a system that placed the needs of the state above all else. The city was quiet compared to other Greek centers. There were no bustling markets filled with foreign traders, no theaters with elaborate performances. Instead, life unfolded in measured routines, where every task had meaning. For boys, the agoge defined their youth. From the age of 7, they lived in barracks with their peers, trained in endurance, combat, and survival. Days were strict and physically demanding, designed to shape them into disciplined warriors. Hardship was considered a teacher, and comfort was rare. Girls remained at home, but were far from idle. They trained their bodies through running and wrestling, believing that physical strength in women would lead to healthier children. They learned to manage estates, oversee helots, and maintain order in the absence of their husbands. Daily life for adults was equally structured. Men spent much of their time in military service or training, eating in communal mess halls and living according to the bonds formed with their fellow soldiers. Women managed households, ensuring the steady production of food and the smooth running of the community. Religion and tradition wove through daily life. Festivals honored the gods, while rituals reinforced unity and discipline. Even in moments of celebration, the military spirit remained present. Processions marched in formation, songs praised courage and obedience. Within the walls of Sparta, life was simple, austere, and unwavering in its focus. Every action, every custom, was a thread in the greater fabric of the city's survival, and every citizen lived knowing their role in maintaining its strength. For centuries, the laws and traditions of Sparta had kept the city strong, united, and feared across Greece. Yet even the most disciplined society is not immune to change. The very structure that once gave Sparta its power began over time to reveal its fragility. One of the first signs of decline was the shrinking number of full citizens. The strict requirements of the agoge, the demands of military service, and the rigid inheritance laws meant that fewer men could meet the qualifications to become Spartiates. As their numbers dwindled, the burden of defending the state fell on an ever smaller group, while the vast Helot population remained a constant simmering threat. Wealth, once carefully suppressed by Lycurgus's reforms, began to creep into the city. Over time, land ownership became concentrated in fewer hands, as estates were passed down to single heirs or absorbed through marriage. This created a small elite with vast resources and many poorer citizens who could no longer afford the life expected of a true Spartan. The equality that had once been their pride faded into memory. External pressures also grew. Other Greek states adapted, forming alliances, building stronger navies, and embracing more flexible economies. Sparta's refusal to change its core system, the very trait that had once made it strong, now left it slow to respond to new challenges. Victories became harder to secure, and defeats carried heavier consequences. The great turning point came when Sparta faced powerful coalitions of enemies. Even their legendary discipline could not overcome the combined force of rivals who had learned to match, and sometimes surpass, their tactics. The loss of key battles shook the city's confidence, and with each setback, the myth of Spartan invincibility weakened. Inside the city, unrest grew. The Helots seized moments of weakness to rebel, and maintaining control required resources Sparta could no longer spare. The traditions that had once bound the people together now felt to some like chains, preventing necessary reform. And so, the city that had once stood as the unshakable guardian of the Peloponnesus entered its long decline. Sparta remained proud, its name still respected, but the peak of its power had passed. The mountains and the river still watched over it, but the spirit that had carried it through centuries of triumph was no longer what it once had been. And so our journey through the story of Sparta comes to a close. May the quiet strength of its mountains and the steady flow of the Eurotas linger in your thoughts as you rest. Thank you for sharing this time together, and may your night be peaceful until we meet again. Good night.